All right, senior scholars, I'm back. I found a bottle of water in my wife's office. Here at the Champlain Memorial Library, where my wife's a librarian, and they're not open on Fridays. So I'm over here. I've been using it for the past several months as my makeshift lecture hall. So, just to bring us back up to snuff, we've got this two-prong attack on Canada with the intention of taking over Canada from the British. And I mentioned that Washington and Arnold both believe that the French Canadians will quickly join our cause. So you've got a force led by General Richard Montgomery in the Champlain Valley up on the Richelieu River now. And you've got Benedict Arnold on the Kennebunk River. So let's talk about what happens with General Montgomery first. Montgomery starts to lay siege to Fort Saint John, sometimes known as Fort St. John, in Quebec on the Richelieu River in September of 1775. Now, this is going to be, as far as sieges go, it wasn't that long, but as you can see on your handout, the fort will not surrender itself to General Montgomery until November 3rd. In the meantime, General Montgomery sends Ethan Allen and about 100 of the Green Mountain Boys up to start scoping out Montreal. Now, Ethan Allen. Ethan Allen, who is sort of a renegade, sort of takes things into his own hands and decides to prematurely attack Montreal. And he does so on September 25th, 1775, and he's going to pay the price for this big mistake. In the process of his attack on Montreal, he and about 30 of the Green Mountain Boys are captured by the British. Ethan Allen will be held as a prisoner of war off and on until his final ultimate release in May of 1778. So it's going to be a good 2.5 years. Allen's going to be a POW of the British, mainly on prison ships, until he finally is traded in a prisoner swap with the Americans. So that was quite a mistake on Ethan Allen's part. Now, ultimately, after an elongated siege, on November 3rd, 1775, Sir Guy Carleton and Major John Preston of the British Army will surrender Fort Saint John to Montgomery. Sir Guy Carleton will flee north to Montreal. So let me just stop a minute here. There's another name we're going to be talking about in the future. Sir Guy Carleton will be the commander of the British fleet that engages Benedict Arnold at the Battle of Valcour in October of 1776. So you're kind of getting the picture that all these people here in the North Country, on both sides, it's sort of a small clique. So, after the capture of Fort Saint Jean, which is also pretty, once Canada's opened up again, you can go up to Saint Jean and tour that area. I've taken groups up there before. It's a pretty neat place. 10 days later, Montgomery will capture Montreal. On his way there, he will capture the fort on the Richelieu River, Fort Chamblay, on his way up to Montreal. Now, the fort at Chambly is also a really great place to visit if you're looking for historic sites. I've taken numerous groups to Fort Chambly. It's a reconstructed fort by Parks Canada that has reenactors and so forth in it. It's got a great museum. If you've never been to Fort Chambly, it's a beautiful place to drive up. You know, it's only about 45 minutes north of the border, right on the Richelieu River. It's a great place to tour and have lunch there. There's a beautiful park next to it. So, on their way to Montreal, they captured the fort at Chambly. Then on November 13th, Sir Guy Carleton figures that Montreal is undefendable, so he abandons the city and flees to what is Quebec City today. So, things are happening pretty successful for General Montgomery in his part of the two-prong attack. It's a different story for General Benedict Arnold. When Arnold and his men arrive at the mouth of the Kennebunk River, which is just a 12-hour sail from Newburyport, Massachusetts, there's supposed to be river boats that he has purchased on behalf of the Continental Army that his men will then board and paddle their way as far up as they can go on the Kennebunk River on their way to Quebec City. Well, there's delays right off the bat. And as it turns out, unwittingly, Arnold has hired a loyalist to construct these boats for him. And there's delay after delay in the construction. And then, ultimately, most of these boats end up being useless the further up the river they get because they're made out of green wood and they leak like a sieve. So the trip starts out horribly. And then as they make their way up the Kennebec, as far as they can navigate, things just really start to turn horrible. Because with all these delays, winter's setting in the wilderness of Maine. And Arnold starts out with about 1,100 men, approximately. By the time he reaches Quebec City, that number is going to have dwindled down to 600 due to disease, desertions, and starvation. Arnold's men run out of supplies and food because the trip is delayed so long. And at one point, when you read the journals of some of these men that they kept on this trip, they have to resort to, because they're starving to death, boiling their leather shoes and making I guess you'd call it, broth out of it. Unimaginable that that's what they had to do to survive. But it's winter, they're smack dab in the middle of the wilderness of Maine, and it's not like they can just go off on hunting jaunts to find wild game. They are supposed to get to Quebec City. So a lot, as far as these men, including Captain Daniel Morgan and some of his riflemen from Virginia and what becomes Kentucky, these are very, very brave men. The men that sacrifice their shoes to make soup out of them then have to wrap their feet in rags and march in the snow. Unbelievable what these men went through. And by no surprise is the force dwindled down to about 600. Now, Montgomery's force, when they arrive in the Quebec City area, is around the same number, somewhere between 500 and 600. So all told, when the actual battle takes place up in Quebec City, the Americans are going to have between 11 and 1,200 men. Now, the reason why Montgomery's men have dwindled is because he's left men along the way. He's left men at Fort Saint Jean, at Fort Chambly. He's left men in Montreal and other sites along the St. Lawrence as he made his way to Quebec. Because the whole idea is they're going to capture all of Canada. So these are sort of prizes along the way. Where on the other hand, Arnold and his men are marching through the wilderness of Maine into the wilderness of Quebec. And I'm sure you really can't tell where one stops and the other begins. So, we're going to skip Colonel Henry Knox activities here momentarily and skip down to December 31st, 1775. That's when Generals Arnold and Montgomery staged their attack on Quebec City. On New Year's Eve, 1775, in the middle of a giant blizzard, this attack takes place. Now, this attack is going to be a failure from the beginning. Arnold's men, when they arrive there, half of them are sick, they're starved, they're really not in any much shape to fight. Montgomery's men are in much better condition, but due to all the delays, now it's smack dab in the middle of the winter, and if any of you have ever been up to Quebec City, you know how damn cold it gets on the St. Lawrence River at the end of December, early January. I mean, that wind's just whistling up and down that river, and it's brutal. And they're fighting in this. Now, unfortunately, also, much to Arnold's chagrin, the French Canadians did not aid them at all. They were afraid of repercussions of the British. They weren't automatic rebels like Washington and Arnold had thought. So it was failure on top of failure. And unfortunately, on the day of that battle, General Richard Montgomery is killed during the battle, which is a huge blow to the Continental Army. He was one of our most experienced generals, and we're going to lose him that day. Benedict Arnold is shot in the leg and wounded, and Captain Morgan and some of his men, Morgan had to take command after Arnold was wounded, he's captured by the British, and he'll be held captive to early 1777. But luckily, he'll be released in time to wreak havoc down at the Battle of Saratoga that we'll talk about later on. So, this is a complete debacle. The American forces end up having to spend the winter outside of Quebec City, trying to survive. We'll talk about preparing for next class, the retreat from Quebec, and some of the battles after the Americans send reinforcements, but then figure out it's a hopeless cause. And we'll talk about how Arnold and others have to limp these men back to the Champlain Valley. And really, it's a miracle that any of them made it back, to tell you the truth. But, as you all know, Arnold will return to fight another day. But we'll be covering that in the next class. So, now on to at this point in his career, he's Colonel Henry Knox, former bookstore owner from Boston turned rebel after Lexington and Concord, and quickly becoming part of the Continental Army under the command of Washington. So Knox comes up with the idea, because he's an artilleryman, is his expertise, that they can get some of the heavy artillery from Fort Ticonderoga and Crown Point all the way over to Boston to defend Boston from the British and ultimately repel them as they do. It's quite a plan. General Washington buys into it, sends Colonel Henry Knox in a detachment over to Fort Ticonderoga, where weapons have been prepared to move to Boston. All these old cannon that were there, well, they weren't old at the time, are from the French and Indian War, and they're mainly all French weapons. Some British weapons have been moved in after the capture. So, General Schuyler had hand-selected 59 pieces of artillery with the destination of Boston. And it was Colonel Knox' duty to get these pieces of artillery all the way back to Boston. Now, we were talking about this in passing last time, and in the meantime, Jack has found that book on the Knox Trail. He sent me an email, and I guess he found it on Kindle. I don't know if there's any print editions available, but we'll look into that also. But I'll send you that link to that Kindle edition. And also, there's various places. I'll send you some links on where you can see the actual trail that Knox used. And, it was referred to last class. That's what that book's all about, all the trail markers and so forth. And marker number 1, as Jim indicated, is at Fort Ticonderoga. Because the first thing they do is start, Knox arrives at Fort Ty on December 5th and doesn't waste any time. The cannon are prepared to be moved. So the first thing they have to do is they move them on the Lachute River, which, if you're familiar with Fort Ticonderoga and Lake George, Lake George, just like Lake Champlain, flows north. It empties into Lake Champlain via the Lachute River, which runs right through the center of present-day the village of Ticonderoga. And the mouth of it's right in front of Fort Ty. If you look down from Fort Ty to the south, you can see the mouth of the Lachute River right there. That's part of the reason why that fortress was built by the French in the first place, to protect that gateway to Lake George. So they get the cannon up the Lachute River. They got to deal with the rapids and so forth, where the village is. But ultimately, that will land them at the very base or the northern end of Lake George. That's where they put these cannon, 59 pieces of cannon, on 42 huge sleds that are drawn by oxen. And their first part of the trip is the entire length of Lake George, which is approximately 40 miles. So they make that journey. I'm going to send you a link to, I found a journal that Knox kept along the way with some interesting tidbits in it. And they make their way to the south end of Lake George, where at this point in history, the ruins of Fort William Henry would be, because the French burned it to the ground in 1757 when they attacked it. It was a British fort during the French and Indian War. Then they're going to make their way south along the Hudson. And according to what I read, Knox will cross back and forth on the Hudson 4 different times. And he's going to utilize parts of the frozen Hudson for these sleds with these very heavy cannons, some of them weighing in excess of a ton. So especially the brass ones are extremely heavy. He'll make his way down south of Albany. I'll send you a link to a map of this trail. Then he'll start to proceed to the east along what, he'll have to make his way through the Berkshire Mountains, which is some tricky going, but luckily it's frozen. And he'll basically follow the route of the Mass Pike to Cambridge, Massachusetts. Now, as you can see, there's going to be obstacles along the way, cannon falling off sleds, the hard time through the Berkshire Mountains and whatnot. But it's pretty amazing that between the 6th and the 9th is when he gets all these cannons together down at the northern end of Lake George. And by January 24th, he's going to arrive in Cambridge, Massachusetts with the 59 pieces of artillery. This is what's really going to make George Washington take notice of Henry Knox, and he'll very quickly be promoted to general. And Henry Knox will be one of Washington's right-hand men during the war because he won Washington's favor immediately by pulling off something that most people thought was completely impossible. But he did it. It's amazing what people could do back in these times. We'll be talking about Baldwin's construction of that bridge connecting Mount Independence and Fort Ticonderoga. Unbelievable what these soldiers could pull off back in this day and age. Especially when, most of us are so spoiled these days, like we're going to drag cannon through the snow and ice for over a month from Fort Ty to Boston. You'd have a hard time finding some volunteers to do that today, that's for sure. So, obviously with those cannon, they're able to defend the heights of Boston, and it changes the initial course of activity, military activity in the Boston area. But that's all, as I pointed out last class, tied to the North Country in the Champlain Valley. So, that's what we're going to cover on Thursday. You guys can, look at the links I send you, sort of study this on your own, and we'll talk about it next Thursday. So please be prepared with questions, or even better, some research you may have found that you want to share with the rest of the class, because I see this class more as a sharing experience. From my take on all of you senior scholars on that first day, you're all highly educated with some pretty impressive backgrounds. And on a lot of these things, I'm sure you know a hell of a lot more than I know about it. And one of the great things that I've discovered that I'm sure Jim discovered in his career, one of the great things about teaching is you as a professor learn something every day too, many times from the students, or them asking questions that you have to say, I don't know the answer to, but I'll find out for you. Every day, the old adage that you learn something every day is certainly the case in higher education. That's why I love it so much, and that's why I'm committed, and that's why I'm sure Jim taught so long, and I'll bet he retired fighting and kicking like I will. So, it was great chatting with you today. I look forward to Thursday. And our second class, hopefully we'll get a couple people that couldn't make it in there. And hopefully, Jim, you got Carolyn all set with her iPad, so she'll be there also by Thursday. If not, call the senior council. Somebody will help you. And I look forward to it. This is going to be a fun 6 weeks. And I'll see you all on Thursday via Zoom. So everybody take care, stay warm, get your vaccines, and I'll see you Thursday.